Here we're going to look at some of the education ordinances which, which guided education, and their impact is still evident in education today. And one of the education ordinance is the Ed Ordinance of 1963. So this ordinance was passed to put control and on all grant-aided schools under the government. So there was a job of really making sure that there's strict control on schools. In this ordinance, there was an intention to eliminate racial groups. For example, the Indians had their own schools, that those were Indian schools, and the colonial leaders were also taking schools to their children to, to some schools, and would now start to create divisions across racial differences on the line of racial differences. Also to eliminate this ordinance was also established to exclude the religious bodies from controlling schools. Contrary to how it was before. Why? Because the government was thinking that there was a lot of divisions and within the populations, and creating developments in schools was difficult, as the government needed to establish a school. The community would not respond. It would want to establish a school that lies within its own preference in terms of religious inclination, meaning that in one community, the government needed to set up several schools, making it expensive. They also feared that these divisions continued, then there will be strengthening hatred among the people that were also evident in the earlier years where there were religious wars of the 1880s and the 1890s. And actually, these religious wars even spread into politics. That even a political head would come from a party would be hinged to a religion. The UPCs, which religion? And DP does. So, so even schools setting up uh, uh, a school and you are not of that religion, so some leaders would ignore to lobby for some schools because they are not within their religious interests. So you would see to eliminate the duplications of the schools simply because of denominations, they needed to pass this ordinance to exclude religious bodies. Actually, they even wanted to make sure that the religious bodies don't set up more schools, though it they tried it, it was not fully possible. Hmm? So, Then there came a 1970 Education Ordinance. Now, this is an Education Act. It is a law. Of course, these were not yet concretized because the Constitution was actually promulgated, was confirmed in 1995. Yes. So this Education Act was introduced by government to put strict orders on opening and operating private schools in Uganda. But mainly targeting these private schools, though it also touched on the ones for by the government. But you remember earlier on, the community had even perceived that establishing schools is a missionary thing, and yes, the government also bought that idea and thought that establishing a school by a private owner, a private person, could be very costly, and that person can exploit the population. So they put strict rules when it will opened. They opened that schools can also be established by private owners. People established schools, but the government needed to take control of them. So everybody that was to establish a school, you needed to go through local authorities, not like the ordinary business. And then they needed to, that's why they instituted the inspectors to come and check whether that school can actually sustain and stay longer. And to prove that, you needed to prove with either you have a lease, you own leased properties, or you are a landlord with a land title. So you have to tender a lease. And if it is a tenancy agreement, then it should not be less than 5 years. Yes, less than 5 years. To at least give an assurance that you're not running away the following day. But the government was also fearing that these religious heads would also go into and establish some private schools and start operating it, which would again promote denominational schools. So it was like trying to regulate establishment of these schools. So of course, in trying to establish schools, regulating people's contributions to schools, because there was also an advent of overcharge. The community had been used to take the child, let the child study. Now in private settings, they are paying. But again, because of distance, people would still take the children to the private schools. But that opening of private schools, you were taking note. also enabled increase the number of schools in the community, because the government would not afford to establish schools from its own coffers. So you can see that the government is trying to run after these church organizations, trying to prevent them from setting up schools. So you would go and register the school, and then you have to declare who are you, and then until when they trace, they make they make it so hard for you to establish the school. But when the private schools increased, they again introduced a tax against them to still kill them, what they call the school tax. Because the people with their religion, you can't cross them entirely. It is a spiritual attachment. So that is the ordinance. So this ordinance also put powers of running these education institutions in the hands of the chief education officer. Now there is called the commissioner of education, and this one would sit at the district to wait and see who is setting up a school. And then you needed to follow all the compliances to make sure that that school you're establishing uh, can actually stand and not to close. So they put up some regulations to make sure that they get assurance that you'll actually stand. At least some structures which are permanent and not entirely temporary. So they actually made it harder for these religious bodies to open up schools. I think they are now lifting it. They have lifted the situation that now they can make branches of their schools. But then a school would be in a place, even if the enrollment increases and you can't accommodate, you, the only school is that one. But because of the regulation, but they have allowed them. That is good. So that so you will see that sorry. You want to these are some of the current issues in education, but even some other issues we were looking at them as historical issues, they are still current issues, which are contemporary issues. You will see that the challenges of education continued even uh, research indicates that this St. Kajubi Education Commission was commissioned in the times before the 1987, but it was an informal engagement between the Idi Amin and the St. Kajubi. And then later on, uh, when when the when President Museveni took over power 1986, after 1 year, he re-engaged now St. Kajubi to study, to institute a commission that is will study the way education undertaking is in the country, and looking at the challenges and make recommendations on the future of education in the country. So this recommendation, one of the recommendations we shall see some more, was to make sure that the schools become comprehensive schools, so that there is a combination of academic running together with practical education. You'll also see that there was a community attitude, uh, where the parents were establishing schools, where the parents were neglecting taking their children to school, simply because uh, due to the flocking, many of the people who had graduated were no longer having jobs, and we are just floating in towns and doing what the community would call ordinary activities. So it also needed that instead of training people to seek for jobs, they actually are trained to do the practice of jobs. That's why there was a need for these comprehensive schools. Some schools these days still have a name, comprehensive. Entebbe Comprehensive School. Hmm. We are going to see some more recommendations of the St. Kajubi, but this was a belief that this commission made recommendations. One, we will see increasing schools, increasing quality of teachers, and making sure that education is not for the rich, for everyone. I will show you a detail of it. And then there is also an issue, that this issue sprang historically in the 1927 and repeated in the 1972 tools, and again it is still prevalent in the current years. The issue of Kiswahili as a medium of instruction. So the colonialists in the colonial times, this is Sir Geoffrey Gowers came up with a decree and declared that in 1927 let Swahili begin to be a medium of instruction in schools, and that schools needed to use Swahili as a medium of instruction. And later on, they had thought that it would become the national language, because they had what they call the closer union. This closer union, they wanted to make sure that the East African community is initiated by having common language, common currency. So that's the decree there, that you would not have Swahili spoken in the region, in the closer region of East Africa, except if it is taught in the schools as a language of instruction. However, the response of the community to the declaration was passive, because you remember that these schools were denominational schools that speak teaching Swahili in the Catholic school, and Swahili was associated to Arabs, that they considered Swahili to be a language of the Muslim, somehow related to Muslim. They would not buy the idea. They thought that it would be a one way of teaching people Swahili, and then after trade them as slaves. The other was that Swahili was not one of the local languages in our community. Then how can it really replace our local language? It was like trying to dilute the dignity of our languages and the identity. And the very time that Swahili was being used by the army to brutalize people and mistreat people, whoever wanted to do what is wrong would use Swahili. Wewe. Simama kuja. So people associated Swahili to torture and brutality. This is an issue of killing national language identity. So people didn't buy the idea of having Swahili as a language of instruction. However, you will see that in the in the 1995, then the government declared that let there be English as the national language, leaving out Swahili. But these days, these oppositions, you'll see the fights that even some teachers thought that instead of Swahili, if you start speaking Swahili and you are to go to the US, to the UK, can you really go and speak Swahili there? They really felt like it has some limitations, which possibly could be some of the reasons today that when it is taught, people may not feel that it is something to opt for. Then we have here other issues that you need to give your focus, to give your attention. There are issues of UPE. Remember in the 1997, when UPE was introduced, this came as one of the recommendations from the St. Zakajubi Education Policy Review Commission. Okay. That yes, UPE was developed and more schools were increased, but issues of quality versus enrollment are still standing. Quality of education, according to you, is UPE quality of education moderate, low, or high? On a scale of 3, you need to see what should be done to increase the quality of education. Then enrollment of learners in the UPE schools, is it high, moderate, or low? Then if it is low, it's also a challenge. If it is very high, it is also another challenge. Then what should be done? There's also an issue of enrollment versus infrastructure. If you find a classroom having 120 learners, then others are under trees. There are also issues pertaining to salary versus teaching. That some teachers find it hard to break through the math, and trying to remove a teacher from the teacher's quarters to start life is like, it is hard. Fees charges versus community attitude and contribution. Yes, that's another issue. So this also cuts to the universal secondary school. Yes. Then mm, mm, okay. So secondary schools, you also need to see challenges there. The skilling Uganda versus the CAP necessity, the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor need. Because there are gaps here where education only focuses on the C, the CAP, the cognitive knowledge. You found that issues such as university graduates are called upon to go and be skilled so that they have something to do. They have papers but cannot do. There was that clarion call for the need to have more skills beyond academic papers. So you need to see how can this gap be realized, where people have knowledge, they have the values, and they also have the skills, that you don't need to pull out people who have graduated from schools to gain skill there. Then what would be the purpose of the school or the university? And then there is also the competence-based curriculum versus academics and the grades. So are we preparing a person for competence or preparing a person for grades? So now, in the second way, if it is competence based, what are the challenges? Training teachers. Teachers don't know what they are supposed to teach. Are they? Mm-hmm. So this is interdisciplinary, the competence based. Yeah. Mm. Mm. I've heard that I've even seen it that This requires students to do group work, but then they have desks, and these group works activities, students maybe need to have tables and
But for
seats.
that one, schools have improvised. We have changed the seating plan. We're no longer using them to face one side. They, 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 they sit in a kind of circular form when they are facing each other so that they can freely interact and come up with relevant arguments.
Mm,
Yes.
okay. Then teaching materials for projects. Uh, are they provided? Are they available?
No, and it is worse in private schools. Buying of materials because there are those materials which they demand. For example, we do FN, but senior senior four mock. I had to spend tending to 5 million, and yet they are advanced in 32 languages.
Mm,
But when they tried to explain to me, I realized it was worth it. Now, you tell the teacher in a private school that spends 4.8 million at once. They'll tell you no. It's the same money. And for them, they say, but we don't force it. If you feel we cannot afford praise the money, we can improvise and make them through. But in management, you shouldn't. Make sure never make yourself be an excuse.
mm,
If you have the capacity to provide the resources, provide such that at one point you are not meant to be the excuse. No, we told the teacher, but that's why they failed.
mm,
We told him.
mhm.
So in private schools, they can't spend that much. Very few, but for what you can spend.
There are also a demand for degrees versus demand for degrees from teachers versus their teachers' responses to having these degrees. Those that will have diplomas, they should have the degree according to the National Teacher Policy (NTP) of 2019. The head teachers, the minimum is postgraduate diploma in education management or education administration, but masters is the requirement. So then the response, what should be done to have this, the teachers responding to the call to have a minimum of a bachelor's? Then what of the roles of the stakeholders to achieving that? I'm just having, are there some government inputs needed to have teachers upgrading? Those are questions to you, the big people in the state. Then there is also something to analyze: their increasing graduates versus the jobs. The graduate problem. What is the way forward? There is also the science versus arts divisions, the salary disparity that those are. So to, well, I would like to close the sessions here. these questions, please, you can take them for your own benefit.